while the circulatory system is about transport, we have to be aware that that's very different than cellular transport across the cell membrane. So circulation is going to be about transport within a body. So earlier in the year when we talked about transport, we were mainly talking about cell transport. And we spoke about diffusion and osmosis and how molecules move across a cell membrane. Is it facilitated diffusion? Is it active transport? Do we need a transport protein? What we're actually focusing on now is the idea that since many organisms are multicellular, we need some sort of method in order to move things throughout the entire body of an organism. So the structure of a circulatory system, if we look at what is the structure of a circulatory system, we're really looking at what is in place, what has evolved, what structures have accumulated as adaptations to help these multicellular organisms best survive in their environment. Keeping in mind that none of these structures are designed, they're the result of mutations. The function of the circulatory system, we've already said, is to transport within a body. Keeping in mind that we do want to maximize efficiency. So when we look at circulatory systems, some animals, now we are focusing on animals, plants have circulatory systems as well. We'll talk about xylem and phloem another time. When we look at animals, there are some animals such as sponges that have no circulatory system. Others have an open and others have closed. To me it makes most sense to first talk about what a closed circulatory system is. And this means that there are vessels or tubes that direct the flow or transport within a body. And so the types of blood vessels that we're really talking about are arteries and arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And so you may be familiar with some of these terms. Arteries, the key thing to keep in mind is these are going to move away from the heart. The heart, where does this come into play? Well, the heart is actually going to be the force, the muscle that provides the force to move things through the body. And so arteries are going to branch into arterioles, which are going to branch into capillaries. So one of the key features of blood vessels is they are branching. And as they branch, they get smaller in diameter, but they actually have an increased surface area. And you can see in this picture the main artery and then branching into arterioles, and then those arterioles branching into capillaries. Capillaries are going to be just one cell thick. And if we go back to respiration and we look at the diffusion of gases and the diffusion of anything, it is going to be important that these are just one cell thick so that diffusion can occur pretty quickly. If we go back for just a second and we look at what an open circulatory system is, they have no vessels. But they do have a heart. And the heart, keep in mind, is the muscle that provides the force. So circulatory system is really going to look at, do you have a force to move things through your body? Do you have tubes to transport specifically to certain regions? Keep in mind that if I have tubes to transport to a specific region, I'm going to be much more efficient. So if we look at the organisms that do not have a closed, that have an open, they're not going to be able to grow very large because they can't direct the flow of blood in their body. One thing that we do have to keep in mind is that we do have the lymphatic system, which is another fluid system. And the lymphatic system will eventually join. But remember, lymphocytes, your B cells, your T cells. And so your white blood cells are going to travel places where the rest of your blood cells don't. Venules and veins are going back to the heart. So very similar in structure to arteries, but they're just moving in a different direction. Okay, so what we really want to focus on next is actually the structure and function of a heart. So the definition of a heart is going to be a muscle. Now it is going to be made of different proteins than a skeletal muscle, but really a heart is a muscle with regulated contractions to provide force. It turns out that this movement is called a circuit. So the circuit is the path in the body. So when the heart pumps, where is that blood, where is that fluid going? And we call that a circuit. What we're going to see is the evolution of what's called a double circuit. So fish are going to have a single circuit. When the blood is pumped in the chambers, they're going to have two chambers, a two-chambered heart. And when the heart contracts, it will push the blood in one circuit. Now keep in mind, that blood will actually be moving counter-current to the gills. So the blood is moving one way, and the gills, the oxygen will be moving the other way to maximize diffusion. The single circuit is going to circulate around the body and return to the heart. Amphibians and reptiles, as well as crocodiles, birds, and mammals, are going to have a double circuit. Because they're going to have both a heart and lungs. So they're going to have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. A pulmonary circuit goes heart, lungs, heart. The systemic circuit goes heart, body, heart. If we stop for a second and think about what the lungs actually do, the lungs are oxygenating the blood and removing the carbon dioxide. So if we're focusing on efficiency, one of the most efficient things that we can do is actually separate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So chambers in the heart to separate oxygenated blood from deoxygenated blood. If we look at amphibians and reptiles, they are going to have a three-chambered heart. The heart is divided into two types of chambers, atria and ventricles. Ventricles are the main pumping muscle. Atria or atrium are going to be the storage location. So if we look at this heart, the frog heart has a three-chambered heart. It has two atria and one ventricle. It still has a pulmonary circuit. So blood from the body is going to enter this atria, go into the ventricle, the heart will contract, the ventricle will contract, and the blood is actually pushed to the lungs. So that is the first circuit. Heart, lungs, and back to the heart. Once it enters the heart again, it needs to be pumped back through the body. So amphibians and reptiles are going to have 3 chambers.
Vicki Fosdick, if you're in the office, would you call extension 400 2000? Thanks.
This ventricle is going to have some division, some channels to separate oxygenated from deoxygenated in the ventricle. We have completely different atria, but the ventricle is still not a completely separated structure. So what we see in the evolution of animals is we see that some animals have no heart, no veins and arteries. Some will have tubes. You always are going to have a heart. And that heart is going to pump blood through the body. Either in the body, like an insect. This is why when you stomp on a cockroach, all the fluid leaks out. There's no tubes or vessels. Or we see the evolution of more and more chambers to help really separate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. If we take a second to look at the circuit of a mammal, specifically of a human, we see this double loop circuit. And so we see blood coming into the atria and then being released into the ventricle, where it is then pumped to the lungs. It will then flow back into the next atria, down into the ventricle, and into the body. Be careful. Does not mean that any of your blood is ever blue. It just means that it is lacking oxygen. And someone used the color blue once to show deoxygenated blood. Another thing that we want to pay attention to is this is actually as if you were leaning over the patient. So even though this is on your left side, this is actually the right atria and ventricle. And over here is actually the left. The left ventricle is actually the most muscular because it is contracting with enough force to push through the entire body. Now, how do we control the heart rate? The heart rate is a really interesting mechanism. It really has to do with nerve signals. Remember, muscles are controlled by nerves. So we're contracting and relaxing the muscle. Think dilate. Dilate is the relaxing. Systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction. We do have valves, which are going to help control whether the blood is able to move in or out. And we actually use electrical signals and the depolarization and repolarization of nerves to control muscle contraction. So again, we're looking at nerves controlling this, and it has to do with electrical impulses, depolarization, repolarization. What we're going to see in the mammalian heart is that we actually have bundles of nerves that are going to help control these contractions, and they're able to respond to things in the environment. They're especially able to respond to signals from the body. So we can control the heart rate in response to what the body needs. So if we need increased blood flow, we're actually going to increase the heart rate. We do have to keep in mind that blood pressure is going to have a big influence, the force with which the heart pumps, but also how much fluid there is. So if there's a high amount of fluid, like water, we're going to have high pressure. And so high blood pressure will sometimes happen if you're retaining too much water, if you're eating too much salt. Hormones will also help control this process. And then we also see that thickening of the arteries because of certain foods will also contribute to that as well. Check out the electrical pulses at the bottom. That's an EK or ECG.